Mr. James Nestor, thank you so much for being with me on The Genius Life.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I feel like I've gotten many requests from my followers to have you on after your wonderful book, Breath, came out. I subsequently then went and I picked it up. I got it on Audible and I listened to it, and I was just thrilled that you had put together such a cohesive work on such an underappreciated topic. You know, the power of breath, of breathing. So I'd love to just start things off by going into your background. I mean, you're a journalist. I can sort of relate to to your career path in that sense. But you've covered a myriad of different topics. So why don't we just sort of go into that sort of backstory, and then how you came to pivot and write about breath for your latest work.
Sure. So I started off having a very respectable job, wore pretty nice shoes, and went down to an office for about 12 years. I was a copywriter. I wrote ads. I managed groups of writers, all that kind of thing. And on the side, I would write magazine articles just to keep my brain sort of activated. And over several years, those articles started piling up. More opportunities came to me, and I finally cut the cord. And that was about 12 years ago. And not the smoothest transition from getting a steady paycheck to like getting no money for months and months. But, I weathered the storm and kept chipping away because I knew that this is what I wanted to do with my life.
That's awesome. You wanted to write books. You wanted to go deep, as opposed to like magazine articles where you'd work on a piece for a few weeks. Books are a lot more intensive of a process. So what was the first book that you wrote after making that decision?
So Deep was the first narrative nonfiction book I wrote. And this was a book, there's a lot of freediving in it, but it was really about the human connection to the ocean. And I know that seems a little fuzzy, but it's a science book, and it looks at not only the way that we are connected through our chemistry, but through various senses that we share with marine animals, such as sharks, magnetoreception, echolocation, mammalian dive reflexes. So I start that book at the very surface of the ocean, and it ends, the last chapter is at the very deepest ocean in the world, at the Marianas Trench.
Are you like the most interesting guy at any party that you go to?
Definitely not. No, no. I failed that test repeatedly. I happen to have a job that allows me to be curious, that I chipped away at for a long time. And there isn't a day that goes by that I'm not grateful for what I do.
Wow, yeah. I mean, so cool. So then what piqued your interest in terms of like breath, how we breathe?
It wasn't one thing in particular, It wasn't like I read some study and thought, "Oh, my next book is in this." It was several things that kept grouping together and kept adding up over so many years. I mean, this process took years and years and years. I'd find an interesting article, I'd read a book, I'd talk to someone who would tell me something impossible, like they cured their autoimmune disease with breathing. Total BS, of course. And then I talked to someone else who said they use breathing to heat their body up, and they no longer need to wear jackets when they're walking in the snow. Total BS, of course. But once I really got to know freedivers, and once I started freediving myself, and once I started reacquainting myself with all of these senses that modern humans, have completely forgotten about, I thought that there might be a larger story in all of this. Not just about how to breathe. That's easy. There's a zillion books about how to breathe, but what happens to our bodies? Where does this stuff come from? What can it do for us? And that's what I spent so long researching.
That's amazing. You open up your book with the story of your participation in an experiment at Stanford. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I had no intention of having myself as a character in this book. The book proposal was written months and months and months before that, and I was nowhere to be seen because I cannot stand it when writers keep unnecessarily inserting themselves into stories. It drives me crazy. But there were a few instances in which I needed to show up, and I needed to test this stuff because there wasn't anyone else who was able to test it. And I had the opportunity working with these experts in the field. So This idea came up about 3 years ago when I'm lucky enough to live in San Francisco, which means I'm very close to Stanford, which is one of the top research institutions in the world. And I got to talking with the chief of rhinology research, Dr. Jayakar Nayak, about the nose, about nasal breathing, how no human really understands or appreciates the power of just breathing through the nose. And so he knew the damage that was caused by persistent mouth breathing, something that 25 to 50% of the population does. But nobody knew how quickly that damage came on. So we decided to test it. 10 days, just mouth breathing, 10 days, just nasal breathing, collecting data the whole way through.
So why is mouth breathing quote unquote dangerous? Like what are the harms that come from excessive mouth breathing?
Yeah, and I'm glad you clarified that, because mouth breathing in and of itself is not a bad thing. I'm breathing through my mouth right now when I'm talking. I breathe through my mouth when I laugh, sometimes when I eat. That's all fine, but it's chronic habitual mouth breathing that is so bad for our health. Because when we breathe through our noses, we humidify air, we heat it, and we condition it so that by the time it reaches our lungs, it's treated, it's purified in some ways. When you breathe through your mouth, you get none of those benefits. You can think of the lungs as an external organ when you're breathing through the mouth. They're just exposed to allergens and pollution and whatever viruses, whatever else is in the air. And our nose is our first line of defense against all these things. And the fact that so few people know this, I certainly didn't know this, and the fact that so many people are mouth breathing, I think that there are very clear links linking mouth breathing to chronic maladies, chronic diseases.
That's fascinating. So there's a potential immune function that the nasal passageway plays as well. You mentioned.
Big time, in various ways. That's what's so interesting about it. So when you breathe through your nose, that air is moving slower, right? It's moving. There's pressure, negative pressure coming in, positive pressure coming out. Those slower breaths help relax your body. They also allow you to help upload more oxygen more efficiently. And there's one other thing in the nose. It helps to release more nitric oxide, and this is this miracle molecule that interacts directly with viruses to kill them. So breathing through the nose, especially now, is essential for good health.
I'm so glad that you brought up nitric oxide. I was going to bring it up, but you beat me to it. It is indeed a miracle molecule, and I over the past couple of months have done a really deep dive into, all of the benefits of encouraging nitric oxide, production. I had an expert on the podcast, and we talked about how when you masticate, when you chew vegetables that contain nitrates that are naturally found in them, like beets, arugula, and things like that, you generate this gas essentially that helps to boost blood flow. It has a dilation effect. It reduces blood pressure. And so you're saying that you get those benefits, the benefits of increased nitric oxide production when you breathe through your nose as well.
That's right. You get a sixfold increase in nitric oxide breathing through your nose, because the paranasal sinuses are coated with these endothelial cells which release nitric oxide. And when you hum, you can increase that by 15 times. So humming, just humming, can increase nitric oxide as well. Foods help. So nitric oxide has a very short bioavailability. It lasts for about 2 to 6 seconds. So you need to constantly be producing this in order for your body to operate correctly. And there's direct links between erectile dysfunction and a decrease in the production of nitric oxide. There's links between diabetes, type 2 diabetes. This goes on and on and on. You really need a lot of nitric oxide in your body all the time, and breathing through your nose is a way of helping your body do that.
Would humming during sex be advisable then?
You can do whatever you want during sex. It's not that's your own dirty business. Whatever works.
This is a safe space, James.
You can certainly try it. Might annoy your partner, but I don't know if anyone's looked into that extensively. But they have definitely looked into the links between 80% of men who have type 2 diabetes have erectile dysfunction. So that's not a random connection. And there's also a reason why sildenafil, I believe that's the actual name for Viagra. Guess what it does? It releases nitric oxide in your body and allows all those things to happen. So the fact that our bodies can naturally produce this miracle gas, and the fact that our nose plays such a huge role in that, to me, I think is just fascinating.
It is. It is fascinating. We generate a lot of really interesting hypotheses on this podcast. Whether or not they have any scientific merit, that's another story. But going back to this experiment at Stanford that you participated in, that 21-day experiment? What did that involve?
It involved just breathing through my mouth for 10 days. It was me and another subject. I managed to convince this poor breathing therapist from Sweden to fly out here on his own dime and participate in this study because Stanford didn't have any money allocated, whatever. So we had to pay for it, which was not cheap. So we had silicone up our noses, which if that sounds like it sucked, it's because it totally did. And we were just breathing through our mouths. And again, this wasn't intended to be like some prank or some stunt. We were just putting ourselves into a position that so much of the population already knew, but we were collecting data the whole way through 3 times a day with huge experiments and huge data collection in between each of the phases of this whole study. So, within a couple of hours, my blood pressure was as high as I'd ever seen it in my life. And a couple hours after that, went to sleep and I snored for an hour and a half. And I had previously not been snoring at all. And the longer the experiment went on, the more I started snoring. I was snoring for 4 hours a night. I had sleep apnea. I had hypertension. I mean, I could just give you this laundry list of bummer maladies, and they kept getting worse and worse.
Wow, that is fascinating. Yeah. So, pardon me. I think I mentioned that it was I said that it was a 21-day experiment. It was a 10-day experiment. I'm just curious, did you do blood work before and after?
You were right, by the way.
Oh, I was right.
21 days.
Oh, interesting.
For the second phase, we breathed through our noses the whole time, or as often as we could. So, and compared data sets. That was the whole point of it, to see how the pathway through which we breathe air affects our bodies. Because I had been told by various researchers, by various professors, that how we breathe does not matter. We can breathe whatever way we want. The body will compensate. And we found that to be complete garbage. And there's a huge foundation of science showing otherwise as well. So, the other 11 days was much more pleasant because we were nasal breathing. We were nasal breathing at night, nasal breathing at day, nasal breathing while we're exercising, and everything else.
I love that. Were you mouth taping? Is that something that you did during the second phase?
Yeah. So this mouth taping thing sounded completely sketchy to me. This is a process or a practice in which you place a little piece of tape on your lips so that you can just breathe through your nose. And seems, pretty weird thing until I heard about it from the doctor of speech language pathology at Stanford, who said, I prescribe it to all my patients. I talked to Dr. Mark Burhenny. He said the exact same thing. I said, what's going on here? They said, because at night, so many of us are apt to gently open our mouths when we go to sleep, right? We got gravity working against us, and I probably slept that way for decades. And one estimate is that 70% of the population sleeps with an open mouth. So taping is just a way of gently closing that mouth. It's not to create a hermetic seal. It's just to train yourself to keep your mouth shut so you breathe through your nose.
And so I'm just so curious. So what did you experience then after those 10 days where you were breathing mostly through your nose?
So my health was completely wrecked from mouth breathing. And we did take blood work. We did pulmonary function tests. We did CAT scans. We did like 4 rounds of different blood work. I mean, it was awful. It was like 8 hours of getting poked and prodded. So a lot of those hormones, like there was a huge jump in cortisol for Anders. The blood, a lot of the blood work was inconsistent or didn't show too much. And what I had heard from the researchers is, these effects will probably come on in months. After several months, you should start seeing some of those broader effects. But as far as stress and heart rate variability and those more immediate changes, all of that came on immediately, high blood pressure and all that. And all of it disappeared when we started nasal breathing, which it's not like we proved anything. People have known this. Researchers have known this for decades, but it was something completely different to experience this yourself, to go from snoring at my worst 4 hours to snoring 0 minutes just by changing the pathway through which I breathe air.
In your research, did you discover any potential reasons as to why so many of us have become chronic mouth breathers?
There's so many reasons, for sure. So there's environmental factors, there's pollution, there is allergens. A lot of people are more allergic. Some people have autoimmune problems. Most asthmatics are mouth breathers. So people have inflamed turbinates. These are the structures in the nose. And some of it is anatomical. So through the last 300, 400 years of human evolution, our mouths have gotten smaller, which means our upper palates, that's the roof of your mouth, have tended to grow upward. And when they grow upward, they can block the sinus passages. So many of us are hosed just right out of the gate. So there's a lot of reasons why we become mouth breathers, and there's a lot of science showing just how deleterious this is to our health.
You were on Joe Rogan's podcast, and I'm not a regular listener of the show. I'm a fan of his. I think he does a wonderful job. But one thing that I know about him is that he had a surgery to repair a severely deviated septum. And I became aware of that because actually my little brother has a very deviated septum, and it prevents him really from breathing freely out of his nose. And so he's considering getting the surgery. I think it's called a septoplasty.
Yeah.
Is that something that you've looked into for people who have structural challenges when it comes to breathing out of their noses?
Some people absolutely need surgical interventions, without a doubt. And I was a great candidate for that. We took a CAT scan of my head, and Nyack, the chief of rhinology research at Stanford, started laughing. You don't want your doctor laughing when he's looking at scans of you. He's like, you are so completely messed up. I broke my nose like 3 times, 4 times. Very deviated septum. I have concha bullosa. Sorry, not up on my Latin. Which are all these deformities in my nose. And he's like, this could really help you out. But then I went down the hall and started talking to other researchers who said, you start slow and steady and try to see what breathing can do for you, because the body is malleable. It shifts depending on what inputs are given to it. And so you could try that. And I absolutely have been transformed by just doing that. I'm not saying this is going to work for everyone. I will say something, though, that a lot of people go into their ENTs, and their ENTs will look at their scans and say, you have a deviated septum. You need to get this fixed. 75% of the population has a deviated septum. So some people have a very deviated septum, and then absolutely septoplasty can really help them. But a lot of people just have a slight deviation in their septum, where if they follow healthy breathing habits, that can have an outsized effect on their ability to nasal breathe. So again, no blanket prescriptions here, but to me, it makes a lot more sense to see what you can do with your natural body before going under the knife.
So wait, you're saying that if you have a mildly deviated septum, you can remodel your sinus airways by just concentrating on nose breathing, or by prioritizing nose breathing?
You will not be remodeling any skeleture in there, but what you will be doing is you will be toning all of the other passages, the turbinates, all of the other erectile tissue in there to dilate, to open up a lot more, and that will allow you to breathe much more easily. And we've seen this time and time again in CAT scans. I took a CAT scan a year before and a year after practicing healthy breathing, after practicing healthy oral posture, after using this device, which helped to stimulate chewing stress, which toned my airway. My airway opened up about 15 to 20% in some areas. And I'm no exception. There's hundreds and hundreds of people that have done the same thing and shown the same benefits. So again, I want to be clear, this is not a blanket prescription for everyone to not get surgery or to get surgery or whatever. Everyone is different. But it's my belief that if we start with easier, free techniques to see what our bodies can do, we can benefit from that. And then you can make a more reasoned decision as to whether or not you need further interventions.
Love that. You know, something that I've discovered recently that I think is pretty could reasonably be recommended to a wide population. I've become kind of hooked on nose strips, like the strips that expand your nasal airways. You know, I actually think that, you know, the term biohacking is sort of thrown about these days, and very little of what you see in the biohacking realm is true biohacking. But I think that actually a nasal strip, because it's hacking the architecture of your nose in a non-permanent way, is actually deserving of the term. And so my reasoning is that if any, you know, if airflow is the rate limiting factor in the production of nitric oxide, then any sort of increase in airflow is going to potentially be beneficial. So I've been using these strips every night when I go to sleep. And now when if I don't have them around, or I forget to put them on, I actually like get out of bed and I go put them on. I'm that hooked on them.
These are great training wheels, and I think that it's an awesome idea. Like, how much do those cost? Not a lot. How much effort is it to use these things? Not too much effort. So you can try something if you're talking about nostrils. You can try something called the caudal maneuver, which is where you place your fingers and you open your nostrils up like that. And if it's significantly easier to breathe that way, then yes, these little hacks can really help you. There's something called mute inserts, which I've used before. You insert them into your nostrils. They help open up. Breathe right strips work great. And what I've found, at least talking to people, and I use some of these things when I was exercising, trying to adapt to nasal breathing during exercise, and they work great. And then after a couple of weeks, I didn't need them. And that's usually what happens. You can acclimate your body. You can start to condition those tissues, those different structures to widen up. And then you just don't need them. If you have to continue using them, that's okay too. To me, and this is just my personal opinion, that might be better than going and getting surgery. But again, everyone's different, and surgery has been transformative for so many people. But there's just a lot of options on the table for people.
Yeah, and surgery is not without risk. But even my brother who has a severely deviated septum, he's benefited from those nasal strips. I've found just anecdotally that my favorite ones are the generic CVS brand. You know, I have a CVS close to my house. Just the generic nasal strips. The what are they? The Breathe Right strips. I find that they leave a residue on my nose and they're hard to pull off.
Yeah, again, personal preference. Some people really dig those. Other people like the non brand name ones. As far as sleep tape goes, I'm a big fan of just this 3M stuff, micropore sensitive skin tape. This costs like $3. It lasts 3 months. That's pretty cheap. People like Somnifix, which is a brand of sleep tape. It's a lot more expensive. They say it's more comfortable. Whatever works, you know, by any means, whatever works to allow you to breathe through your nose that's the right thing to do for you.
I love that. What's one of the more surprising things that you discovered while writing this book? I'm sure there were many mind-blowing moments for you, but if you could just think back to, like, you know, something that you discovered that just blew your worldview wide open.
Well, I think it was two things. I know you only want one. I'll mention two briefly.
I'll take two.
It was okay.
Two for the price of one.
Thank you. Yeah. It's discount day. It's Tuesday. So it's the fact that we're so messed up. Like the fact that evolution is not progressive. This was complete news to me. That evolution means change. It doesn't mean survival of the fittest. If it meant survival of the fittest, why are so many of us obese? Why do we have autoimmune diseases? Why do we have asthma? It just doesn't make any sense. And once you learn that, you can't unlearn it. You're like, wow, I've been taught something completely different for so long. And now that I understand that life can change in ways that are not advantageous for their long-term survival, it starts making the world a little more clear in the way that things are functioning right now, especially with our species. The second thing that blew me away, which continues to blow me away, and next week I'm doing a little more research in this area, is the fact that we can use breathing to heat our bodies up. And the fact that monks have been doing this for thousands and thousands of years. This sounded like complete fabrication, that someone could sit in the snow and breathe in a certain way for 8 hours and melt a circle around them in the middle of winter. It sounds fallacious, right? Until you learn that Herbert Benson at Harvard Medical School went out and tested these guys and found that we can do exactly that. And Wim Hof, which I'm sure you've heard of, he's the one who is really blowing this up and showing people the true power of their breathing to not only heat themselves, but to heal themselves of so many chronic conditions.
Didn't Wim Hof make headlines when his breathing method prevented an inflammatory challenge from showing up on blood labs? Wasn't there something that he did that like actually affected whether or not he, became vulnerable to some kind of endotoxin that was injected into his blood?
Yeah, and this is what really blew things up in this world and continues just to confound me. And it's been interesting that some researchers have denied that this happened because it's so outside of their worldview. Even though the study was published in Nature, the top scientific journal in the world,
Yeah.
and even though people are demonstrating this all the time. So anyway, we'll get into that later. But what happened is they took Wim into a lab and they shot him up with E. coli. And if you get an E. coli infection, which is an endotoxin, you start sweating, you get a fever, you get chills, you're totally miserable. So they shot him up with E. coli. He breathed in his Wim Hof way, doing that Tumo breathing, and he was completely fine. He had basically no symptoms. He got up, got a cup of coffee. So the researchers told him, they said, listen, you're just this super weirdo. We see that you can do this, and that's cool. But anyway, we're moving on. And Wim challenged them. He said, give me any group of people and give me 4 days, and I will teach them how to do this. So that's exactly what they did a few years later. They did a randomized controlled study in which they had a control group, and then they had the group that learned Wim's method. And guess what happened? Every single one of those people who learned his method went in, were shot up with E. coli, breathed in that pattern, and didn't suffer any symptoms of E. coli. Meanwhile, all of the controls suffered extreme symptoms of E. coli. So there's the proof, everybody, and they're just trying to get their heads around how exactly this works. Down at University of California, San Francisco, Alyssa Epple just concluded a study in rheumatoid arthritis and this breathing method. I'm talking to her next week about all this.
She's a telomere researcher, isn't she?
She is indeed, yes.
She is, yeah. Love her work. So, I mean, obviously, we're just sort of at the very beginning of unraveling how his method may have prevented, infection from E. coli. But is there any? Can you speculate at all? I mean, like why that might have worked the way that it did?
Absolutely. So what happens when you breathe this way is you stress your body out. And a lot of people are thinking, I don't want to be stressed. I'm stressed all day. So a lot of us carry around this low-grade stress, which is so unhealthy. It gives us chronic inflammation, which leads to so many modern diseases. I was talking to Dr. David Hascom last week, and he said every modern disease is a disease of inflammation. Alzheimer's, diabetes, on every autoimmune disease, on and on and on. So we don't want this chronic low-grade stress, but we do want bursts of stress. And this is what Alyssa Epple is working on, this hermetic stress or hormesis, where you control your stress to a specific amount of time so that for the rest of the day, you can chill out. So that is probably why Wim Hof's method works so well and why you can get shot up with E. coli and not suffer from any symptoms. Because when we stress our bodies out, when we're breathing like this, we release adrenaline, norepinephrine, and other hormones that actually fight off viruses. So the sympathetic state is the state in which we can help fight off viruses and toxins. And so that's what it does. That's the ongoing theory right now is when you know you're exposed to something, you can do this method and help your body combat it very quickly. And very anecdotally here, a couple years ago when I felt a very bad cold coming on, I went and did this method. I really went for it for half an hour and came out and I didn't have a cold. What does that mean? Nothing much. But I've heard the same thing from literally dozens and dozens and dozens of people. And it's free and it makes you feel good. So why not give it a go?
So you're forcing an acute sympathetic state that just basically puts your immune system on high alert.
Exactly right. I wish I could have said it that succinctly. I feel like a fool. The next answer will be extremely succinct, like a haiku, I promise.
As succinct as that. You're doing pretty well, James. Have you done any in your book? Do you talk about the difference between diaphragmic breathing versus like the more shallow upper body chest breathing that so many of us seem to be stuck, in that sort of mode of breathing these days?
Sure. So your posture dictates how you breathe, and your breathing dictates your posture. So if you're like me, if you're an office bozo and you're just sitting in front of a computer all day long, you tend to be hunched over like this. Even if you want to take a very deep fluid breath, you can't because your back is arched. So you can only take many very short and stilted breaths. I was talking to Patrick McEwen, who's a world-renowned breathing expert, and he showed me this chart that just blew me away. When we breathe just into our chest, and we breathe about 18 times a minute, which is on the upper end of average, but so many people breathe this way, we only use 50% of that oxygen we take in. So the rest of it just goes into our mouths, our throats, the bronchi, and we breathe it back out, because just a little bit of it actually makes it to the lungs and can participate in gas exchange. But when we breathe slowly at a rate of about 6 times a minute, we use 85% of our breath. So a 35% increase in efficiency. And who the hell doesn't want that? Who doesn't want to run more efficiently? So this very slow and stilted breathing will force us to overwork our bodies, overwork our hearts, overwork so many other systems in our body, and eventually our bodies are going to break down. So that's one reason to take fewer breaths, but deeper breaths, and to engage that diaphragm and do what it is naturally designed to do.
I love that. I think we're also more inclined to breathe shallowly when we're stressed out, as opposed to just being merely a function of posture. I think when you're stressed, you take these like short breaths. And you got me thinking whether or not we can de-stress ourselves by forcing deeper breaths.
For sure. And yeah, I should have mentioned that. So when we're stressed out, when we have a perceived threat, we do what we're conditioned to do. We either hold our breath or we breathe too much. Because back in the day, when we were hiding from enemies in a cave or hiding from a woolly mammoth or whatever, what is your best defense? To be silent or to breathe a bunch so you can get more blood to your skeletal muscles so you can run faster or fight harder, right? So these are wonderful things to be programmed with. But now our perceived view of threats is so low that we get an email from our boss and our bodies react as though it were a severe life-threatening situation. And so we have this response where we either hold our breath or we breathe way too much. And this is so well known. It's called constant partial attention syndrome. It's been studied by someone at another doctor at UCSF, Margaret Chesney, for about 20 years. NIH studies, legit stuff. It's also known as email apnea. And one estimate says that 80% of office workers suffer from this. I wanted to see if I suffered from it, so I wore a pulse oximeter, and I wore it for several days, and I looked at my breathing throughout my workday, and it was a total disaster. I was holding my breath or breathing way too much the whole time, and no wonder I was so exhausted at the end of work days.
Email apnea. So just the waiting on bated breath for for all the notifications and whatever, that it's actually causing us to breathe differently in a more counterproductive way.
Yeah, and what Margaret Chesney has found is she said it can have some of the same downstream effects of sleep apnea. It can give us chronic inflammation. It can stress us out. It can boost our blood sugar, which is not always a good thing. It can have this little elicit this adrenaline drip, on norepinephrine, on and on and on. All those hormones are great. Those reactions are great when we need them. But to do them throughout the day when there is no threat is going to wear us down. I mean, look at how many people have autoimmune diseases right now. How many people have diabetes? How many people have depression or anxiety or panic? Things aren't good for us right now, and our breathing plays a really large part in that.
So what's the prescription then for listeners to make sure that their breath, that they're breathing deeply with their diaphragms, and to let that sort of guide their posture, to let their breath lead the way, so to speak?
There is one blanket prescription I'm going to give everyone. That doesn't matter if you're an asthmatic or you suffer from anxiety or if you're an ultra marathoner or whatever. So breathe through your nose. Breathe through your nose all the time. If your nose is clogged, figure out a way of opening your nose. Nyack told me, he's like, if a sink is clogged in your house, what do? You find a way of opening it. So breathe through your nose. Breathe slowly. Breathe less. Train yourself to breathe less, okay? By breathing less, we get more oxygen. We get more energy with less effort. That's what you want. And to exhale fully. So a lot of us will tend to think we're breathing deep. We'll go, yeah, deep breaths. This is cool. Yeah, I can really feel it. This is awesome. But we don't exhale. So we're just forcing air on top of air on top of air. What you want to do is exhale first fully, and then take that deep breath. That engages the diaphragm, full diaphragmatic movement. And so breathing isn't just a biochemical process, it's biomechanical. That diaphragm moving up and down helps with circulation and helps to pump lymph fluid. This is how lymph fluid gets away from our organs. And I'm talking to another doctor on Friday about all of this stuff. We're going to do a video interview because I've just gotten clued into this that we'll have on the site and be available for free for everyone.
I just love that you've covered this topic in your work and that you've become a champion for nose breathing. It's so important. Ever since I started looking into the literature, my mind, like yours, I'm sure was before you wrote the book, has just been completely blown by this, and it's become something in my life that is now a staple. You know, just like eating a nutritious diet, exercising regularly, making sure that I'm managing my stress, breathing through my nose is something that I'm now, it's now always in my purview.
And that's a good thing. It's a weird thing to pick that as my campaign, but it was only after years and years of listening to so many researchers and looking at the science, it was so undeniable, and yet no one's really talking about it. I mean, think about when you go to your doctor. They check your blood pressure. They ask if you have any anxiety. They ask maybe about your sexual performance. They ask about migraines, but they don't ever talk to you about your breathing. They don't look at your levels of O2 or CO2, but breathing is the anchor to so many of those issues. And if you fix your breathing, as we've seen very clearly, you can really blunt the symptoms, or in some extraordinary cases, heal yourself of those chronic problems. I know this sounds nutso, but the science, again, is very clear, and I could give you the phone numbers of 24 people who have done just that.
Man. In LA, where I live, there many people are obsessed with breath work, which is it ranges from holotropic breathing, to various meditation ceremonies. Have you studied that at all in your journey?
I have. I just spilled water all over myself. So thank God this isn't all video. I guess it is. I'm hosed.
It's okay. Just breathe deeply so that you don't have a stress response. Well, I can't see the water.
It looks like I just coughed up some vomit on my lunch on my shirt. So taken out of context, this could really be incriminating. Let's talk about, speaking of vomit, let's talk about holotropic breath work. So holotropic breath work is this breathing practice in which you breathe as hard as you can in a room full of people listening to very loud music, and you do this for 3 hours. And if that sounds like things are going to get weird, they get real weird real quick. And so some people can have very severe reactions to this, bowel reactions or vomit reactions. That does not happen too often, but it can happen. And the point of doing this is to break through chronic problems. The thinking is this is a baptism by fire method of really opening up your subconscious and unconscious mind and bringing your problems to the surface so that you can better process them. The science is not very thorough in this area. We know what happens to the body when you breathe this much. However, I will say the studies I've seen and the people who have practiced this that I've talked to, James Ironman is a great example. He ran this with 11,000 people in a hospital in St. Louis and followed over 400 of them and found that this had a profound benefit for these people, whether or not they had depression or they were addicts or they had other psychoses. So there it is. I wish that there were more studies on it. There's not, but breathing is free, and I promise you, it is an extremely surreal experience. So you could give it a go. Tell me what you think.
You know, people love to do it in LA. I've never been a big fan. The experience has always been a little bit too uncomfortable for me. But one of our colleagues in journalism, Michael Pollan, I had him on the show, and we talked about how holotropic breathing has been. There are at least some similarities to the shift in consciousness that occurs when you take psychedelic drugs, like psilocybin mushrooms, and that, these could be a sort of more mild and, of course, drug-free means to unraveling the psyche in the way that they're now kind of looking at these drugs, for their potential to ease things like PTSD, depression, addictions, and things like that. So a very interesting line of research indeed.
That's how it was developed. So it was developed by Stan Grof, who was a big proponent of using LSD with his patients. And when LSD was made illegal in 1968, he looked for other methods to elicit those same reactions, and he developed holotropic breathwork. So what is interesting is looking at the biochemistry, is looking at what happens to the body when we breathe really hard for a really long time. And they've found that you can decrease the blood flow to the brain by about 40% in extreme cases. And what this does is it cuts off certain centers in your brain that are dealing with day-to-day life. And so the thinking is that by cutting off some of these centers to the brain, other centers can help open. You can process thoughts in a different way. So we know it's doing something, and you can certainly feel it and experience this when you do it. It is a deep dreamlike state that you put yourself into for hours. But what exactly is it doing? I don't know if we're ever going to know. And I've been trying to get in a lab to do EEG studies or fMRI studies of holotropic breathing because I can't find any. So I have volunteered to go in and breathe this way for 3 hours so we can really look at what happens to the body. Now COVID's around, that got, put on the back burner, but hopefully in the next few months I'm going to be able to do this.
I love it. How has your life changed since writing breath? Any new practices that you've integrated into your day? What's been your life like in the wake of writing this book?
Yeah, well, writing a book about breathing makes you a complete breathing neurotic. I don't suggest anyone do it. It will drive you crazy. But the point to train yourself to breathe in these ways isn't so that you constantly have to think about it. It's so that they become a habit. And if you're a really bad breather like I was through so much of my life, it takes a long time to break habits. I'm still working on it. I still use sleep tape every single night. I've used it for 2 years and have experienced a huge benefit from doing that. So another thing is people expect me to now, be like the best breather in the world, but I'm not. Just like Pollan isn't the best drug taker in the world. I'm a journalist who went into this field to write about some of the best breathers in the world, to write about the experts, and to glean a few of their hacks along the way. So yeah, I've incorporated the stuff into my life. Yeah, I've felt completely transformed from it, but that's no proof of anything, which is why I had to rely so heavily on the science, because these claims sound impossible. There's 500 scientific references in the back of the book and on the website for people to look up, but this is stuff that we've known for so long. It just hasn't really come to the surface in any way and gotten to the hands of the general public. And as a journalist, that's what I do, what I try to do.
It's amazing. Your book has been so successful. Has it, do you think, helped draw more attention, especially from, academia, to the value of breath?
Yeah, and this is really the highest compliment and the thing that really gets me the most giddy. It's interesting to go into these institutions to find research that has been done at these institutions, write about it, and then have the same institutions come back to you and say, "Hey, we didn't know about any of this. Can you come speak at our medical school?" So the best letters I've been getting, I've gotten dozens and dozens and dozens of them, maybe even hundreds of them, are from doctors, are from dentists, some of whom have been saying, "This is what I've been talking about for 30 years. No one's been listening." And others who have said, "This all makes perfect sense. Why haven't we known about it? I'm going to go do something about this." So I've had the honor of speaking at Stanford Medical School. I'm speaking at Yale and Harvard next year. It seems like there's a lot of interest in breathing right now, especially amidst this pandemic. It's better late than never, and I'm so excited to get this word out, and I'm so excited to get more researchers interested in studying this stuff and getting the word out, because really it comes from them. They're the ones kickstarting how this thing is going to get to patients, and so it can't just come from a journalist. It really has to come from academics who understand this and who have tested it thoroughly.
Yeah, I love that. What's next for you? Can you give us any hints?
I'm gonna turn off my phone for 10 days and sleep for a while. It's been a little crazy, 6 months. Amazing, but I'm a little exhausted at this time. I'll be honest. So we're hoping in the new year. This is all knock on wood stuff, but to turn this into a mini series, and that's what I'd really like to do in the next year, because a lot of people read books, but a lot of people don't read books, who might be turned on to this stuff to help take control of their own bodies through other mediums. And so there's that, and I have a few other creative projects and a few other book ideas, but I just need a reset, and that thank God the holidays are coming, and I'll figure out how to tackle all that next.
You need a breather. See what I did there?
Some might say I need to just chill out and just breathe fully. Man, why are you so stressed out? But if I hadn't have had those hacks, I probably would have been in much worse shape. So it's stuff that I use every single day and have really felt and seen measured improvement in my life.
Well, your work is so important. It's added so much value, and I'm so glad that I got a hold of your book and that I listened to it. And you're also a wonderful writer, so I implore people listening to this to go and check out Breath. It's also on Audible. It's very well done. I've got just one last question for you, but before we get to that, where can listeners find you on social media, and where can they find your book? I mean, I'm assuming it's everywhere, but.
Sure, wherever books are sold, which I guess nowadays means like Amazon or no. Go to your local indie, people. Ignore what I just said. Cut that out.
Support your local bookstores.
That's right.
Yes.
So my website, the publisher allowed me to publish the entire bibliography on the website, and that's available for free for anyone. There are also breathing instructions by doctors at Johns Hopkins and Columbia, and Dr. Andrew Wiles on there. I'm doing expert interviews with professors at Harvard all about breathing, and that's available at mrjamesnestor.com. That's mrjamesnestor.com. Some other ass took James Nestor, so that's what I'm stuck with, people. I'm trying to get better at this thing called social media. I don't know if you've heard about it. I'm a little old, so I am on Instagram, and I'm just posting stuff related to breathing and the science therein. No puppies or good-looking food on my site. I promise.
Oh man, I like Mr. James. It's better than the, when people put the before their names. It's a little pretentious, like thejamesnestor.com. I think Mr. is fine.
Thank you for that. Appreciate that.
It works. Not something I ever have to worry about.
I get a lot of gruff from people. People think that's pretentious. And I said, hey, some sculptor in Michigan took my URL, so I got to wait around for that guy to give that up to the internet, and then we'll see what happens.
Yeah. Well, the last question that gets asked to everybody on the show, Mr. James Nestor, what does it mean to you to live a genius life? What does living a genius life mean to you?
I think it means to be flexible, to be open, to listen to as many people as often as you possibly can, and to take that information, be skeptical about it, and check it out. I think that when you think of science, this is not a closed book. Science is constantly changing. So the thought that you can just stop your belief system at one point doesn't make any sense scientifically. So that flexibility and that curiosity, I think, is what really drives science and what drives journalists.
I love that. Couldn't agree more. Well, thank you. This has been a pleasure. I learned a lot, and yeah, it was just cool connecting with you, getting to know you. And you're up in SF, you said?
San Francisco,
Nice.
yes.
Nice. Well, if you're ever in the LA area, love to grab a coffee, maybe do some breath work together. That would be fun.
Would love that. I was born in Orange County, so old LA family. So I flew the coop early on, but would love to do that.
Nice. Well, thanks again to all you guys out there in podcast land. I appreciate your time and attention. Text me to let me know what you thought about this episode of the show. Did it blow your minds? Let me know. My number is 310-299-9401. I look forward to hearing from you. Go to thegeniuslife.com. We got some really cool merch up. And I will catch you on the next episode. Peace.